for the direction, but it's you. I need protection.
Alright, welcome back, y'all. Good morning, good evening, or good night, whichever applies. I'm coming to you live and direct, straight from inside the belly of the beast, as always. And this time we're going to be discussing the behavioral sciences, of which I'm supposed to be a part, of course, but that's why I'm telling you about it, because, I think you guys should know about some of the more sinister aspects of how these sciences got their start. So let's go ahead and get into it. And today we're going to be drawing on the work of a author named Rebecca Lemov. She wrote a book called World as Laboratory, and you should definitely check that book out. It's a little bit dry, I think, at times, but it definitely gives you the background that you need in terms of understanding how the behavioral sciences began and how that relates specifically to what we talked about before in terms of social engineering. So for now, we should just consider this to be synonymous with the social sciences. You could really complicate that if you want to, but it's not important today. But as Lemov points out in her book, Beardsley Ruml, this guy pictured here, although little known, is someone who should be credited, at least she thinks, for his role in providing foundational research and ideation for the underlying sort of philosophy of the American and Western conception of the social sciences or behavioral sciences. So that's Mr. Ruml. And doubtless, as she says, there's others that we can think of when we think about the social sciences. There's a lot of names that come to mind first. Comte, Marx, Spencer, William James, John Dewey, all these kind of people. If you're African American, you might think of W.E.B. Du Bois, Ida B. Wells, Carter G. Woodson. And those people all had major impacts on the social sciences in terms of how they developed. But there's some figures that get kind of brushed aside, and the sort of nefarious aspects of what they contributed get brushed aside as well. So we want to pay special attention to those histories. Ruml in specific played a unique role historically in terms of developing foundational implementations of social control technology. So working one time as the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which we hear a lot about nowadays, and later getting a PhD in psychology from the University of Chicago, then being a corporate executive, industrial psychologist, foundation director, university dean, and so on. These are all common sort of background points for people in adjacent walks of life. And he doesn't necessarily stand out from that alone. However, of particular note to us is that Ruml, between 1922 and 1929, received $50 million from an arm of the Rockefeller Foundation. And think about how much that'd be worth today. $50 million over 100 years ago. And he was only 26 years old when he was put in charge of dispensing it, so younger than me. I wouldn't know what to do with $50 million. So Ruml, as she writes, quote, defined the social sciences for the first time as a collective entity capable of social and human engineering. So, social engineering, right? Another person you want to think about is this cat right here, Walter Lippmann. Walter Lippmann, you could go and make a whole video talking about this dude. His influence on, in particular political science and journalism is massive. This guy was advising multiple presidents, and he has a lot to do with sort of how these people came to think about specifically the topics of public opinion, mass publics, stereotypes, how these relate to political science. And I could go into some of the problematic aspects of him, but we'll leave that alone for right now. But trust is very similar to what you just heard about Mr. Ruml. Likewise about some of the other people I've mentioned that have these close relationships to U.S. Information Agency and other sort of propaganda arms of the U.S. government. Another person to think about is Elton Mayo, the father of industrial management and human relations, something that we generally, think of positively, HR, right? But you have to consider why they would have come up with HR in the first place, and we'll talk about that in a moment. Likewise, there's Harold Laswell, who is considered an inventor of propaganda studies. Among the early foundations that help establish public policy through social regulation, we find, of course, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, the Commonwealth Fund of Standard Oil of Edward Harkness, and the Russell Sage Foundation, widowers of Olivia Sage, and likewise, of course, the Julius Rosenwald Fund, built from the empire of Sears Roebuck. Sears catalog, all that good stuff. So this is a map of Julius Rosenwald Fund schoolhouses. And an important thing to know about this is that a lot of this land, if not most of it, was taken essentially from African Americans in the South who weren't allowed to go to the schools that were available. And in order to be able to go to school, they had to build their own schools. So the land that they had, that they often were together to sort of pool money together to purchase in the first place or to be able to build a schoolhouse on, was essentially confiscated. And then this Rockefeller or Rosenwald money came in, and this is where the schools came from. The public schools, that is, for everyone after that. So in a lot of ways, this is similar to the sort of history of displacement that we see in other areas. Yes, Black people got education out of this, but what was the cost? Someone else was, in control of that education. The Ford Foundation, of course, is the sixth of these, but rose to prominence much later, or a little bit later. By and large, this was, as Rebecca Lemov argues, a world of, quote, East Coast WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant extraction. These people are Ivy League educated, and most of them living in New York City. These are also people who are more or less dedicated to the general goal of social reform, quote unquote, or progressivism. And the important thing here to think about is what were their goals with progressivism and so-called reform? There's sort of a co-optation process that happens with reform from this top-down level. When these people with all the money to create new technologies to engage in different forms of social control are the ones in charge of your education, in charge of your employment, in charge of the sciences. No matter what they believe, they're doing in terms of reform or progressivism, it's generally going to be in their interests. So you want to think about why are they supporting it? And if that overlaps with what you believe, why might that be? There's a lot to think about there. There's a lot to disentangle. It doesn't mean every aspect of progressivism is bad necessarily, but you just want to think about where these incentives you may have overlap with those that the billionaires may have. And this is a problem that's been going on for, at this point, at least a century, maybe a little bit longer. Depends on your perspective, of course, on capitalism and things like that, but certainly in terms of these millionaires and billionaires. So someone could probably do an investigation into the accusation that, people that look at things this way are conspiracy theorists. That's something I'm going to talk about another time. I'll do a video on the term conspiracy theory and how that's been used, and essentially try to break that down with the help of some philosophers that discuss the topic, and we'll get into that. But you want to know that people who make the accusation that this sort of power elite, these billionaires, these foundations control society in some way, have long been accused of being conspiracy theorists. So just keep that in mind. That's usually what that claim is about, aside from the sort of CIA context or the Karl Popper, social theory of conspiracy theories. Lemov also cites specifically the intersection of events surrounding the 1914 Ludlow Massacre of striking workers and their families in Colorado. So for that, you want to look into scientists of industrial management, which also came out around the same time, where we see players like Rockefeller Jr., president of the Rockefeller Foundation at the time and of Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, who caused the massacre, and likewise Ellen Mayo, mentioned above, quote, whose program to adapt industrial workers to their task by de-radicalizing them through psychological counseling would seem to suggest this emerging social science was anything but neutral, as examples of the rationale behind these so-called conspiracy theorist scholars. So again, this shows us that these people that, are accused of conspiracy theories in terms of thinking about this stuff and who's in control, it's pretty obvious that they're not. They're just describing the situation in terms of the political economic circumstances. But, when you control the sciences and the people in them and you fund them, you get to tell people that they're conspiracy theorists and write them off. So this is an image from that time period depicting the Ludlow Massacre. And that's something you should go and read about separately. So not unlike the realignment that we see today and the fear associated with that regarding quote-unquote democracy, which we see from the likes of individuals like Peter Thiel of Palantir, which is of course CIA funded. And you can look to Whitney Webb's book, One Nation Under Blackmail, and a lot of her other work, which you can find on YouTube and elsewhere. But she talks a lot about them, this sort of PayPal mafia, the individuals that were involved in the founding of PayPal who have now gone and spread out, Horowitz, all these people. But you've also got these dark Enlightenment figures like Curtis Yarvin, Nick Land, and I guess you could include someone like Elon Musk. Certainly he's sort of in that orbit. He kind of goes in and out of it, but clearly he's a part of that. He puts forward the same talk about quote-unquote democracy failing and all this stuff, while also pushing the race science stuff at the same time, behind the scenes. I mean, it's not really that subtle, but a lot of people seem not to notice it somehow, so gotta mention it. As Lemov writes, quote, democracy, in short, was frightening, and in the absence of heavy-handed authorities of old, might devolve into mob rule. Accordingly, a new science-based authority, streamlined and logical, would bolster the chances for true democracy to survive, unquote. So that was the belief not only of, some of the people we see today who have taken that a little bit further, but that was the belief of these Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation individuals who, many of whom were, closely associated or became closely associated with the intelligence agencies, later on in the Cold War, and a lot of the sort of nefarious activities surrounding that. And there's a YouTube channel here called Eyes Wide Open, I believe, that has phenomenal history in terms of understanding some of that stuff. So I'll link them in the comments as well, but his videos are excellent. So of course today, the baby of democracy is thrown out with the handbasket in favor of some form of technocratic authoritarianism, which will be called meritocracy, obviously having nothing to do with actual merit, so-called. But this has a similar degree of truth value as so-called democracy. Every time it's invoked as a description of American history, it's really a sort of propaganda from the elites. It's their impression of what's going on. They're like, look, we've given you these rights. It's basically a democracy. But of course, they're building on Socrates. They're building on Madisonianism, the Federalist Papers 55. And I'm not a James Madison scholar, so you can let them counter-argue that. Go hear what they're saying in terms of that. But I think it's pretty clear that there's a foundation in America of fear of quote-unquote mob rule, fear of the masses, fear of populism, fear of all these kinds of things. And you could understand some of that, but in terms of lynch mobs and things like that, of course. But at the same time, we want to be wary of how this sort of attitude and how it's been institutionalized prevents people from talking about genuine conspiracies, right? Especially conspiracies that have happened inside of the sciences or inside of the political regime. And we could go in deep on that. We will on the conspiracy video once I get to it. So Beardsley Ruml, as she notes, in 1922, quote, had already served as assistant to the president of the Carnegie Corporation, James Angle, his graduate school advisor, and had developed psychological testing for the War Department, also known as, quote, the classification of personnel, under Walter Brigham, another of his professors. The war-related psychological profiling led him toward industrial psychology, a way of fitting workers to their jobs and jobs to their workers by means of, quote, mental engineering. And likewise, psychotechnology, and just as well, workplace efficiency gauges, thus inaugurating a fusion of psychology's tests and measures with corporations' labor needs that continues into this century. So I just saw a video this morning of, and I assume it was real, but who knows, but it looked to be an AI program that's built into, a security camera in a coffee shop, and it was assigning sort of productivity values to the employees, to the baristas. It was like, this barista made 10 cups of coffee so far, this one made 20. You can imagine how much worse this kind of thing is going to get. But what you want to pay attention to is the fact that this has been going on. And who has been funding it? You know what I mean? Who has been contributing to it and pretending they weren't? Well, the behavioral sciences have been a big part of that, to be honest. And again, I'm telling you that from up here, right next to these people. So Ruml, in an effort to appease the old guard by arguing that the old aims of social welfare and the betterment of mankind could best be fulfilled through the social sciences, set out to block together and define these sciences, and perhaps was the first to do so, according to Rebecca Lemov. So as she writes, quote, The Memorial's policy papers from 1922 through 26 used the term, quote, social welfare pretty much synonymously with social engineering and social intelligence and social technology. This is where, the field of criminal justice basically comes into play as potentially able to be shaped by the work of what we come to be called social scientists. So as the social sciences followed from this shape, they took the form of scientific positivism with quote-unquote watchwords, including order, control, and objectivity. As she claims, initially these words were more than a matter of sloganeering, brute imposition, or naive scientism, which is like a sort of faithfulness to science, which that's another topic we'll talk about soon. But even if all these things existed and would come more or less into play as the years progressed, quote, rigorous observation, not fleeting embrace, would be the way for Ruml and social scientists going forward, hoping to capture the real. In particular, this was to be true of the University of Chicago, where his plan was fully accepted, then later Yale at the Institute of Human Relations, and thereafter the Brookings Institute, Columbia University, and the London School of Economics, and of course, Harvard University. It's worth reading into histories of some other individuals as well that sort of were in this nexus. So one of them is William Isaac Thomas, I believe is his name. Yeah, that's the cat picture right here. He was an anthropologist. She described him as a dandy and a free thinker. So you can look him up and figure out what that means. I mean, I know, but you go figure out and let me know. Another individual was Robert Park, who worked closely with Booker T. Washington and University of Chicago. And the University of Chicago, you should know, essentially facilitated turning the city of Chicago into a giant social engineering experiment. Everyone in the social sciences knows this and understands this reputation, and there's sort of almost a wariness about Chicago in terms of reflecting on that history, especially as relates to sociology and this industrial management type of stuff. But this is a, incredibly important history, and it's really actually not unique to Chicago. That's what I want to argue, and that's what I show with my dissertation, which is specifically, of course, about Hampton Roads. And relating to that, of course, we have Booker T. Washington. And Booker T. Washington is a complicated figure. Obviously, I'm someone that I like to talk about individuals like Marcus Garvey. I like to talk about the Nation of Islam. I like to talk about a lot of groups that other people generally classify as problematic for all kinds of reasons. And Booker T. Washington is also one of those people. And I could give you a complicated picture of him another time, but he's definitely a part of this in terms of at least how these white individuals or so-called white individuals were attempting to sort of engage in co-optation of this formerly enslaved man from Virginia, Booker T. Washington, to facilitate producing a class of black people going forward, for instance, at Tuskegee and at Hampton University, who would be sort of relegated to certain kinds of jobs and certain kinds of thinking. Now, there's the Hampton model of education, and we could talk about that as well another time, but essentially that's about literally black folks that are just off the plantation. They're trying to force them into essentially that same kind of work right after the Civil War. That's what the white missionary from, who had already colonized Hawaii, who came over to Hampton Roads, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, that was his goal with Hampton University. And I say it's complicated because many people have tried to make the argument that I think is understandable that Booker T. Washington was actually a sort of strategic individual who, he knew these white people were trying to play him basically, and he tried to do his best to make some gains for black people despite that. And I think that's, in many ways a valid argument. You can still make critiques of him while understanding that to be the case. And we'll just leave that there, but understand that even though I say that's true, he was still a part of this production of, what they saw as a class that would be subservient sort of infinitely going forward. So of particular interest to Elton Mayo, as far as his contribution to the social sciences, was the question of the social radical or renegade and how his disruptive behavior could be controlled. So we see how important that is today, again with the label of conspiracy theorist and counterinsurgency efforts and all these kinds of things, right? So early in his career, he studied leftist activists, revolutionaries, and rabble-rousers, and understood their activities as pathology that stem from imbalances in their bodily secretions, which goes back to this sort of old Victorian kind of logic, but likewise their past histories and minds. So you can see Mayo's book, The Mind of the Agitator, which discusses those who simply could not take orders from an authority figure at work in the industry. And this also relates to the diagnosis that's called oppositional defiant disorder, which tends to be related with ADHD. And again, that's something we could talk about another time, but notice that connection. Notice how similar that is and how that comes out of this sort of research trajectory. What does that tell you? Another thing to think about is the Hawthorne experiments. So this is Hawthorne Works, a factory in Cicero, Illinois. And the way the story goes is that there were experiments going on at the Hawthorne Works that involved changing the lighting in different areas and different experiments along those lines to try to see how it affected people's behavior, specifically their productivity. So this shows you that laboratories are basically a kind of factory, and that's how they were seen, that's how they were used. Or excuse me, sorry, I put that in reverse. Factories are kind of laboratory. So, quote, the Hawthorne experiments were set for a radical new style of organizing and supervising industrial workers, especially those in repetitive assembly line jobs. They were widely credited with putting the human factor back in industrial equation, where scientific management had factored it out, and doing so via so-called HR or human relations. This led to industrial sociology and personnel management. Therapy was proposed as a way to negate the possibilities of agitation and rebellion, which of course reminds us of the purposes of race as social control, both in the colonies and later. For example, in the normal schools meant to only teach you labor, hard work, and subservience, specifically for African Americans, and under the leadership of Booker T. Washington. And, like I mentioned, his white advisor, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, at the Hampton Institute. Mayo set out to understand and focus on worker psychodynamics, such as the we factor, quote unquote, which is a topic that we investigate frequently in political science and in psychology, and it's called something like in-group feeling, sentiment, belonging, or with specific reference to African Americans, linked fate. So that's essentially what I have for you for today in terms of thinking about that. This is Mr. Mayo, I believe, but yeah, behavioral sciences, massive part of the social control infrastructure and development of technology related to social control.
Map in your mind, here's the pineal gland. Subliminal labial licking, think you in command. Isosceles possibly control it from a foreign land. Synapses collapse when the fascists demand. The screens be their passes to wipe out your fam. You way too distracted to see or give a damn. Did you even know your left brain control your right hand? Split it from the right brain, the waves getting jammed. Surfs up.